My name is Darlene Walker, and I am 62 years old. For 40 years, I loved my husband Harold with every fiber of my being. When he was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at 67, I dedicated myself entirely to his care. I never imagined that one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while folding laundry near his study, I would overhear words that would shatter my world. "I just want her to divorce me first," he whispered into the phone. The pain of that moment still takes my breath away. Before I begin this journey through betrayal and unexpected strength, I would love to know where you are watching from. Please hit that like and subscribe button and settle in for a story about how sometimes the most painful betrayals lead to the most powerful reclamations of dignity. I met Harold in the spring of 1983 at a community fundraiser in Boston. I was 30 years old, working as a nurse at Massachusetts General Hospital, and had sworn off relationships after a particularly painful breakup the year before. Harold stood out immediately in the crowded hall. He was tall with salt and pepper hair, despite being only 35 intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a laugh that seemed to fill the entire room. When he approached me that evening, I was arranging silent auction items, trying to make sure each display looked appealing enough to bring in donations. He picked up a gift basket and pretended to examine it seriously. "I think this needs to be rotated approximately 26 degrees to the left for maximum visual impact," he said with complete seriousness, though his eyes twinkled with mischief. I laughed despite myself. "Are you an expert in silent auction arrangement?" "No, but I am a history professor, so I do know quite a bit about presentation and engaging an audience," he replied, setting down the basket exactly as I had arranged it. "Harold Benson," he said, extending his hand. "Darlene Walker," I replied, shaking it. By the end of the night, he had my phone number, and by the end of our first date, the following Friday, I knew my no relationship rule was in serious jeopardy. Harold was unlike anyone I had ever met. He spoke about history with such passion that even the most mundane details became fascinating. He listened when I talked about nursing with genuine interest. He asked thoughtful questions and remembered even small details I mentioned. I resisted for 6 months, keeping our relationship casual, even as I felt myself falling for him. My previous relationship had ended when I discovered my boyfriend had been seeing someone else for most of our 2 years together. The betrayal had left me wary and protective of my heart. "I understand you have walls up," Harold told me one evening as we walked along the Charles River. "And I respect that, but I want you to know that I am patient, and I will wait until you trust me enough to let them down." He was true to his word. Harold never pushed, but he was consistently present, trustworthy, and kind. After those 6 months on a crisp autumn afternoon, with leaves crunching beneath our feet in the Boston Public Garden, I finally told him I was ready for something real. We were married 2 years later in 1985 in a small ceremony surrounded by our closest friends and family. The day was perfect in its simplicity, just like our relationship. We wrote our own vows, and I can still remember the intensity in Harold's eyes as he promised to love me, in sickness and in health, through all of life's joys and sorrows, until my last breath. After we married, we settled into a comfortable life in a cozy 3-bedroom colonial in Lexington. Harold continued teaching at Boston College, eventually becoming department chair of history. I specialized in geriatric nursing, finding fulfillment in caring for elderly patients with compassion and dignity. We tried for children in those early years, suffering through 2 miscarriages that tested both our strength and our marriage. After the second loss, we sat in our small backyard garden and had the difficult conversation about whether to continue trying. "I want you to know," Harold said, holding my hands tightly in his, "that you are enough for me. If it's just us for the next 50 years, that would be the greatest gift of my life." His words lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. We decided together to embrace a life without children, channeling our nurturing instincts into our careers, our friends, and eventually our chosen family. That chosen family began to form through Harold's colleagues and my fellow nurses. We hosted regular dinner parties, game nights, and holiday celebrations. Our home became a gathering place filled with laughter, intellectual debates, and deep friendships. One of Harold's colleagues, Margaret Thompson, became a regular at these gatherings. She was an art history professor, brilliant and sophisticated, with a quiet confidence I admired. She was a few years younger than me, never married, and seemingly content with her independence. Harold and Margaret shared academic interests and often collaborated on interdisciplinary projects. I never once felt threatened by their friendship, appreciating how she challenged him intellectually. Margaret thinks we should consider leading a study abroad program in Florence next summer. Harold mentioned one night as we prepared dinner together. What do you think about spending a month in Italy? That summer in Florence became one of my favorite memories. Harold and Margaret led students through museums and historical sites during the day, while I explored the city and volunteered at a local clinic. In the evenings, the three of us would often have dinner together, drinking wine and discussing the day's adventures. It was during this trip that Margaret truly became part of our inner circle. For over 30 years, Harold and I built a beautiful life together. We traveled extensively during summer breaks, created traditions with our friends, advanced in our careers, and grew together through life's inevitable challenges. Our love deepened with each passing year, becoming more comfortable but no less passionate. I never imagined anything could threaten what we had built. Even as we entered our 60s, I felt secure in our bond, proud of our history, and excited for the retirement years ahead. We had plans to travel more, perhaps volunteer, and enjoy the fruits of our decades of hard work. Then came the day that changed everything, the day Harold couldn't remember how to get home from the grocery store 3 blocks away from our house. The day our future began to unravel in ways I never could have anticipated. I first noticed something was wrong when Harold started forgetting small things. Keys misplaced, appointments missed, names of former students temporarily forgotten. I dismissed these lapses as normal aging. After all, we were both in our 60s and everyone becomes a bit forgetful with time. But the day Harold called me in a panic from his cell phone, saying he had driven to the grocery store but couldn't remember how to get home, I knew this was different. I stayed on the phone with him, guiding him through the 3 familiar blocks back to our house, my heart pounding with fear. "It was the strangest thing, Darcy," he said that evening, using the nickname he had called me for decades. I walked out of Stop and Shop and suddenly nothing looked familiar. It was like being in a foreign country where all the street signs are in a language you don't understand. I made an appointment with our family doctor the next day. Dr. Patterson had been our physician for 15 years and knew us well. He listened carefully to our concerns, conducted some initial cognitive tests, and referred us to a neurologist for further evaluation. The next 3 weeks were a blur of appointments, tests, brain scans, and blood work. Harold approached it all with the analytical mind of an academic, asking detailed questions and taking notes after each consultation. I focused on logistics and emotional support, managing the calendar and holding his hand through the uncertainty. We sat together in Dr. Ramirez's office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon when the diagnosis came. The neurologist's face was compassionate but serious as she reviewed the results. "The tests indicate early onset Alzheimer's disease," she said gently. "The brain scans show patterns consistent with the beginning stages." Harold's hand tightened around mine. I felt my world tilt on its axis. At 67, my brilliant historian husband, who could recall dates and details from centuries past, was facing a future where his own memories would gradually slip away. "What does this mean for us? For our future?" Harold asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Dr. Ramirez explained the progression we could expect, the treatments available to potentially slow the disease, and the importance of support systems. She emphasized that early onset cases sometimes progress differently than those in older patients, and that Harold's intellectual engagement might help preserve cognitive function longer. In the car ride home, we sat in silence for several minutes before Harold spoke. "I don't want to be a burden to you, Darlene," he said, staring straight ahead at the rain streaking down the windshield. I turned to him, taking his face in my hands. Harold Benson, you listen to me. We vowed in sickness and in health. This is what that meant. We will face this together one day at a time. He kissed my palm, his eyes filling with tears. I'm so afraid of losing myself, of losing us. I won't let that happen. I promised with more confidence than I felt. I will hold our memories for both of us. The early stages of caregiving were manageable. Harold continued teaching for another semester with accommodations from the university. I scaled back my nursing hours to be home more. We established routines, put systems in place to help with memory, and attended support groups together. We told our friends about the diagnosis, and they rallied around us with the meals offers of help and, most importantly, their continued presence. They made efforts to engage Harold in the intellectual conversations he loved, showing patience when he occasionally lost his train of thought. Margaret was particularly supportive. She offered to collaborate on a book with Harold, giving him a meaningful project to focus on while accommodating his cognitive changes. She would come to our house once or twice a week to work with him in his study, bringing research materials and handling the technological aspects that had become increasingly frustrating for him. You're a saint, Darlene, Margaret told me one afternoon as she was leaving after a work session. The way you care for him, the patience you show, it's remarkable. I brushed off her compliment. It's not sainthood, it's love. As the months passed, I watched subtle changes in Harold's personality. My gentle, patient husband occasionally snapped over minor frustrations. The man who had always been meticulously honest sometimes told small lies to cover memory gaps. His sense of humor darkened, and sometimes he made cutting remarks that the old Harold never would have uttered. Dr. Ramirez assured me these changes were normal with Alzheimer's. The disease affected not just memory, but could alter personality as well. I tried not to take it personally when he lashed out, reminding myself it was the disease, not my husband. About a year after his diagnosis, I noticed Harold becoming increasingly attached to his cell phone, something that struck me as odd. Before his illness, he had been almost comically disconnected from technology, often forgetting to charge his phone or leaving it behind. Now he kept it with him constantly, often taking calls in his study with the door closed. When I asked about it, he became defensive. I still have colleagues and friends, Darlene. Just because I'm sick doesn't mean I'm not entitled to private conversations. I backed off, not wanting to upset him, but the behavior seemed unusual. Even more puzzling was how these phone calls seemed to coincide with periods of remarkable lucidity. He would emerge from his study after these calls more like his old self, more coherent and engaged than he had been before. One day, when Harold was napping, I checked his recent calls. Most were to or from Margaret's number. This didn't immediately alarm me given their work together on the book project, but the frequency and timing seemed excessive. There were calls late at night, early in the morning, and multiple times throughout each day. My nursing background had taught me that Alzheimer's patients often have good days and bad days, windows of clarity amid the confusion. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond the disease was happening with my husband, something he was deliberately keeping from me. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Harold was in his study while I folded laundry in our bedroom across the hall. The door to his study was partially open, and I could hear him on the phone, his voice uncharacteristically clear and focused. "No, I understand," that he was saying, "but the timing has to be right. I just want her to divorce me first." I froze, a pair of his socks in my hands. My heart seemed to stop, then restart with painful intensity. "It would be easier that way," he continued. "Darlene has been taking care of me. If I left her now, everyone would see me as the villain. But if she gets frustrated and leaves, people would understand." I sank down onto the edge of our bed, the laundry basket sliding to the floor. The socks I had been holding fell from my numb fingers. The voice coming from the study was unmistakably Harold's, not the confused, often disoriented man I had been caring for, but the sharp, strategic professor I had married. "I know you're getting impatient," he said, his voice lower now, forcing me to strain to hear. But trust me on this. Darlene will reach her breaking point soon. This disease is exhausting her. When she initiates the divorce, we can be together without the social fallout. My vision blurred with tears. My chest felt tight as if all the air had been squeezed from my lungs. I had dedicated the past year of my life to caring for a man who was apparently plotting to manipulate me into leaving him. The betrayal cut so deep I could barely process it. For a moment, I tried to convince myself it was the disease talking. Alzheimer's patients sometimes confabulate, creating false narratives or memories. Perhaps Harold was having a delusion, a brief break from reality. But his voice had been too clear, his strategy too calculated. This wasn't confusion. This was premeditation. I moved silently from the bedroom to the bathroom, locked the door, and slid down against it to the cold tile floor. Only then did I allow the sobs to come muffling them with a towel pressed against my face. I cried until I had no tears left, until my throat was raw and my eyes swollen. When I finally emerged, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. The woman looking back at me appeared decades older than she had that morning. Her eyes held a pain I had never seen before, not even when we lost our pregnancies, not even when Harold was first diagnosed. I took a deep breath and made a decision. I would not confront Harold immediately. I needed more information. If he was having an affair, if he was planning to leave me, I needed to know exactly what I was facing. That night, I served dinner as usual, engaging in our normal conversation about his day, about the book project, about a letter we had received from old friends. Harold showed no sign that anything was amiss, alternating between periods of confusion and moments of clarity, as had become our norm. After he went to bed, I took his phone from the charger and went through it methodically. The call history showed exactly what I expected: frequent calls to and from Margaret. There were text messages too, dozens of them daily, though most were innocuous discussions about research or scheduling their next work session. But then I found a thread from the previous week that made my blood run cold. Margaret. Are you sure this is what you want, Harold? More certain than I've been of anything. I love you. I've loved you for years. Margaret. But Darlene has been so good to you, especially since the diagnosis. Harold. I know. That's why I need her to be the one to end it. I can't be the bad guy. Margaret. How much longer do we wait? Harold. Not much longer. She's wearing down. Be patient. I sat at our kitchen table, the phone clutched in my shaking hand, reading and rereading the messages. Years. He had loved Margaret for years. How long had this been going on? Had their relationship predated his diagnosis? Had their work sessions on the book project been covers for something else entirely? I scrolled back through months of messages, but found nothing earlier that definitively proved a physical affair. Their relationship might have been emotional before his diagnosis, perhaps even one-sided, but these messages made it clear that something had changed. The next day, I called the number I didn't recognize that appeared frequently in Harold's call history. A woman answered on the second ring. Hello. Her voice was hesitant. Who is this? I asked, though I already knew. There was a pause, then the call disconnected. I immediately tried Margaret's regular number, but it went straight to voicemail. The confirmation was painful but necessary. The unknown number was likely a second phone, one she used specifically to communicate with my husband. Over the next few days, I pieced together more of their deception. On afternoons when I attended my caregiver support group, Margaret had been coming to our home. Our neighbor mentioned seeing her car in our driveway on Thursdays when you're usually out, confirming my suspicion. I checked our joint credit card statements and found charges for restaurants on days when Harold had claimed to be meeting former colleagues. Small gift purchases I had assumed were for his nieces now took on a different meaning. The most painful discovery came when I found a small notebook in Harold's desk drawer. Despite his memory issues, he had written down details of conversations with Margaret, plans they had made, even little reminders about things she liked. M prefers daisies to roses, one note read. Remember anniversary of Florence trip, said another. I was living a nightmare. The man I had devoted my life to, The man I had promised to care for through his devastating illness was systematically betraying me with a woman I had considered a friend. One night, when Harold was asleep, I finally broke down completely. I sat in our backyard garden, the same place where years ago we had decided together to embrace a life without children, and I allowed myself to feel every ounce of the betrayal. I felt like a fool. All those times Margaret had praised my caregiving, called me a saint. She had been coveting my husband, perhaps even actively pursuing him. Had she taken advantage of his cognitive decline to finally win his affection, or had there always been feelings between them that I had been blind to? The next morning, Harold called me Margaret during breakfast. It was a simple slip, the kind of error Alzheimer's patients often make, confusing names of people close to them. But now the mistake carried a devastating weight. "I'm not Margaret," I said quietly. "I'm Darlene, your wife." He looked confused, then embarrassed. "Of course you are. I don't know why I said that." But I knew why. And that afternoon I made the call I had been dreading. Margaret answered her regular phone this time, perhaps not recognizing my number. "It's Darlene," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. There was a long silence. "Darlene," she finally said, "how are you? How long have you been having an affair with my husband?" I asked, cutting through any pretense. Another pause. "It's complicated," she replied. "No, actually, it's quite simple. You're sleeping with my husband while I care for him through Alzheimer's. You're encouraging him to manipulate me into divorcing him so you can be together without looking like the villains you are." "He's not happy, Darlene," she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "He hasn't been happy for years. The disease has actually given him clarity about what he wants in whatever time he has left with his faculties intact." Her words were like a physical blow. "And what gives you the right to make that decision for him, to take advantage of a man with a degenerative brain disease?" "I'm not taking advantage," she insisted. "If anything, I'm helping him find happiness in his final coherent months. He loves me, Darlene. He has for years, but he was too honorable to act on it. Now, with his diagnosis, he doesn't want to waste any more time." I hung up without another word. Her justification made me physically ill. The idea that betraying me was somehow a noble act of seizing happiness in the face of tragedy was beyond comprehension. That night, I watched Harold sleeping peacefully beside me, the man I had shared a bed with for nearly 4 decades. In sleep, he looked like my Harold again, not the stranger he had become both through disease and deception. I could file for divorce as they clearly wanted. I could walk away, let them have each other for whatever time Harold had left before the disease claimed too much of him. It would be the easiest path, perhaps even the one most people would understand. But something inside me rebelled at giving them exactly what they wanted. After everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed, I deserved better than to be manipulated into being the villain in their love story. No, I would not divorce Harold. But neither would I continue to be deceived. I would confront this situation on my own terms, with the dignity and strength that had carried me through every other challenge in my life. The day after my conversation with Margaret, I called my oldest friend, Samantha Miller. Sam and I had been friends since nursing school, and she had gone on to become a family law attorney. I needed both her friendship and her professional perspective. We met at a small cafe, far from my neighborhood somewhere Harold and Margaret would never go. Sam arrived looking concerned. We had spoken briefly on the phone, but I hadn't shared the full story yet. "You look terrible," she said bluntly as she sat down across from me. "What's happened?" Over coffee, I poured out the whole sordid tale. The overheard phone call, the text messages, the evidence of their meetings, and my confrontation with Margaret. Sam listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from shock to anger to deep sadness. "I am so sorry, Dar," she said when I finished. "This is beyond cruel." "What would you do?" I asked her, desperate for perspective. She thought for a moment. "Professionally speaking, you have options. You could file for divorce citing adultery. With Harold's condition, you would likely receive substantial spousal support. Or You could separate without divorcing, which might be financially advantageous given medical expenses. And personally speaking, I pressed. Personally, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. I would make damn sure they didn't get what they wanted. Her words crystallized something that had been forming in my mind since the previous night. They want me to be the bad guy, I said slowly. They want me to get frustrated and leave so they can be together without judgment. So Harold can preserve his reputation as the poor, abandoned man with Alzheimer's. Exactly, Sam nodded. So whatever you do it on your terms, not theirs. We talked for hours, working through various scenarios and options. By the time we parted, I had the beginnings of a plan. It wasn't about revenge, though I certainly felt the burn of that desire. It was about reclaiming my dignity and exposing the truth in a way that would allow me to hold my head high regardless of the outcome. Over the next week, the plan refined itself as I moved through a spectrum of emotions. Some moments, I was consumed by rage so intense my hands shook. Other times, grief would overwhelm me, and I would find myself weeping in the shower or while driving alone. Occasionally, doubt would creep in, making me question everything I thought I knew about my marriage. Had Harold really been unhappy for years, as Margaret claimed? Had I been blind to problems in our relationship? I spent hours reviewing our life together, searching for signs I might have missed. But every memory I examined reinforced my belief that what we had was real and precious, making the betrayal all the more incomprehensible. The turning point came during a rare moment of startling clarity from Harold. We were looking through old photo albums, an activity recommended to stimulate memory in Alzheimer's patients, when he paused at a picture from our 20th anniversary trip to Maine. "You've always been the best thing in my life, Darlene," he said with such sincerity that for a moment I wondered if I had imagined everything. Then his phone buzzed with a text from Margaret, and his expression changed, becoming guarded and distant. The transformation confirmed everything. In that moment, my path became absolutely clear. I would not slink away in shame or sorrow. I would not give them the clean break they desired. Instead, I would bring everything into the light where the truth could speak for itself. I decided to host a family gathering at our home, ostensibly to update everyone on Harold's condition and discuss future care plans. I sent invitations to his sister Grace and her husband, his brother Thomas and his wife, our closest friends, and a few of Harold's former colleagues who had remained in touch since his retirement. And then I sent one to Margaret. The text was simple. "Harold and I are hosting a gathering on Saturday at 3 p.m. to discuss his care going forward. As someone important in his life, your presence would be valuable." She responded almost immediately. "I'm not sure that's a good idea, Darlene. Harold specifically asked for you to be there." I lied, using their own manipulation tactics against them. "He's having a good week cognitively and wants to talk about the book project with everyone." After a long pause, she replied, "All right, I'll be there." With the guest list confirmed, I began preparations. I cleaned the house thoroughly, ordered catering, and selected family photos to display around the living room. To anyone observing, it looked like I was simply organizing a supportive family meeting. But each action was part of my carefully constructed plan. I confided in only two people, Sam and my sister Judith, who lived in Chicago but agreed to fly in for the gathering. I needed allies who understood exactly what was happening and could support me through what would undoubtedly be an emotionally grueling experience. The night before the gathering, I sat alone in our garden again, rehearsing what I would say, preparing myself for every possible reaction. I was terrified, but resolute. Whatever happened the next day would change everything, but at least the change would be on my terms, not theirs. As I finally went inside, I passed Harold's study. The light was on, and I could hear him on the phone again, undoubtedly talking to Margaret. I paused, listening to his voice, so clear and decisive, compared to his usual confused state. "Tomorrow will be difficult," he was saying. "Darlene thinks it's just a family meeting, but I'm going to tell everyone about us. It's time." I almost laughed at the irony. Even now they were plotting, thinking they were in control of the narrative. Little did they know what awaited them. I went to bed, feeling strangely calm. For the first time since overhearing that devastating phone call, I felt like I had reclaimed some power in this impossible situation. Tomorrow would bring pain, certainly, but also finally truth. The day of the gathering arrived with perfect early autumn weather. Sunlight streamed through the windows of our home, illuminating the rooms where we had built our life together. I had been up since dawn making final preparations, my mind focused entirely on the task at hand rather than the emotional storm that waited. Harold was having what his doctors called a good day, one of those periods of relative clarity that still punctuated the increasing fog of his condition. He seemed aware of the gathering and its purported purpose, though he appeared nervous picking at his breakfast and checking his phone frequently. "Are you sure we need to do this today?" he asked, his fingers tapping anxiously on the kitchen table. "Maybe we should wait until I'm feeling more myself." "You seem very much yourself today," I replied calmly, "and everyone has already arranged to be here. It's important that we discuss your care as a family." He nodded reluctantly, then retreated to his study until guests began to arrive. Grace and her husband David were the first to arrive, bringing a homemade casserole, despite my assurances that food was taken care of. Grace had always been protective of her younger brother, and since his diagnosis, her concern had only intensified. She hugged me tightly as she entered. "How are you holding up?" she whispered. "One day at a time," I responded with my standard answer, the one that revealed nothing of my inner turmoil. Our friends arrived in quick succession. Jack and Elaine Thomas, who had been part of our dinner party circle for 30 years. Paul Richardson, Harold's best friend from graduate school. Beth and Michael Connor, our neighbors who had become close friends over decades of shared holidays and backyard barbecues. Sam arrived with her husband, giving me a subtle nod of encouragement. My sister Judith came shortly after, immediately taking charge of arranging food and drinks her way, of supporting me when words failed. Harold emerged from his study and greeted everyone warmly, though I noticed him glancing frequently at the door. Waiting for Margaret, no doubt. At precisely 3:15 minutes after the gathering was scheduled to begin, the doorbell rang one final time. I opened it to find Margaret standing on our porch, a bottle of wine in one hand and a folder in the other, presumably containing materials related to their book project, as a cover for her presence. "Darlene," she said stiffly, her eyes not quite meeting mine. "Margaret," I replied, stepping back to allow her entry. "So glad you could make it." She hesitated before stepping inside, her eyes scanning the assembled group in our living room. I saw the moment she realized this was a larger gathering than she had anticipated. Her posture stiffened, and a flicker of alarm crossed her face before she composed herself. Harold's reaction was equally telling. When he saw Margaret enter, his entire demeanor changed. His back straightened, his eyes brightened, and for a moment he looked more like the man I had married than he had in months. Then, as he registered the full room of friends and family, panic replaced the momentary joy. I allowed everyone time to settle in, to fill plates with food, to engage in the usual small talk of such gatherings. Harold and Margaret carefully positioned themselves on opposite sides of the room, though I caught them exchanging glances when they thought no one was watching. After about 45 minutes, when everyone had eaten and the conversation had reached a natural lull, I stood and gently tapped a spoon against my water glass to get everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming today." I began, my voice steadier than I had dared hope. "As you know, Harold's condition presents challenges that will only increase with time. I wanted us to gather as the people who love him most to discuss how we can best support him through what lies ahead." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his seat while Margaret stared intently at her plate. "Before we get into specifics about care options," I continued, "I want to take a moment to thank each of you for your support throughout this difficult time. Your friendship, your visits, your phone calls have meant the world to both of us." I made eye contact with each person as I spoke, ending with Margaret. She flinched slightly under my gaze. "Some of you have gone above and beyond," I said, my voice taking on an edge that caused Sam to sit up straighter, recognizing that the moment had arrived. Margaret, for instance, has been spending considerable time with Harold, ostensibly working on their book project. Margaret's head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. Harold began to stand, but then sank back into his chair as if his legs had given out. What many of you don't know, I continued, is that Margaret and Harold's relationship has extended far beyond professional collaboration. They have been having an affair, conducting their relationship behind my back while I care for my husband through his illness. The room went absolutely silent. Grace gasped audibly. Paul's mouth fell open in shock. Beth reached for Michael's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Darlene," Harold began, his voice a strangled whisper. "This isn't the place." "No," I replied, turning to face him directly. "Where is the place, Harold?" In whispered phone calls when you think I can't hear, in text messages planning how to manipulate me into divorcing you so you can be with Margaret without social consequences. Margaret stood suddenly. "This is unfair. You don't understand the situation." "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "I understand that my husband of nearly 40 years and a woman I considered a friend have betrayed me in the most painful way possible. I understand that you've been using his moments of lucidity, the precious clear windows in his condition, to conduct your relationship rather than to connect with his wife." "Harold has been unhappy," Margaret began, but was immediately cut off by Grace. "How dare you?" Harold's sister said, rising to her feet. "How dare you speak for my brother? How dare you take advantage of him when he's vulnerable?" "I'm not taking advantage," Margaret protested, looking around the room for support and finding none. "Harold and I love each other. We have for years." All eyes turned to Harold, who sat with his head bowed, his hands trembling slightly. In that moment, he looked every bit the confused, ill man he usually was, not the calculating figure I had overheard on the phone. "Is this true, Harold?" Paul asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Have you been having an affair with Margaret?" Harold looked up, his eyes moving from Paul to Margaret to me, then back to Margaret. For a terrible moment, I thought he might deny everything, might claim confusion or manipulation on my part. But then he nodded slowly. "Yes," he said quietly, "but it's not as simple as Darlene makes it sound." "Then explain it to us," I challenged, fighting to keep my voice from breaking. "Explain how betraying your wife during her devoted care of you through Alzheimer's is anything other than cruel." He looked at me, then really looked at me, and for a flash, I saw recognition in his eyes, saw the man who had promised to love me through sickness and health. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know how to explain it." Grace moved across the room to sit beside her brother. "Harold," she said gently, "what Margaret has been doing is wrong. She's been taking advantage of your condition." "No," he protested weakly. "She loves me." "And Darlene," Grace pressed, "the woman who has stood by you every day, who has learned everything there is to know about your disease, who has rearranged her entire life to care for you. What about her love?" Harold looked confused again, the brief window of clarity closing. "Darlene," he repeated, as if trying to place me. The room collectively held its breath. In that moment, I saw the full tragedy of our situation with painful clarity. Harold was caught between moments of manipulation and genuine confusion. How much of this was the disease, and how much was the man I might never know? "I think you should leave Margaret," Grace said firmly, breaking the tense silence. Margaret looked around the room, seeming to finally grasp the full impact of what had been revealed. Whatever justifications she had created for their relationship were crumbling under the collective judgment of those who truly cared about Harold and me. "This isn't over," she said, grabbing her purse, but her words lacked conviction. "Yes," I replied simply. "It is." As Margaret walked to the door, no one spoke or moved to stop her. The click of the door closing behind her seemed to release a collective breath from the room. What followed was a blur of embraces, tears, and quiet conversations. Our friends rallied around me with a force of love that nearly broke what remained of my composure. Harold sat quietly with Grace, occasionally asking confused questions that suggested he was losing track of what had just happened. "I am so proud of you," Sam whispered when she hugged me. "That took incredible courage." By early evening, most guests had departed, leaving only Grace, David, Judith, Sam, and her husband. We sat in the kitchen drinking tea and discussing practical next steps. Harold had retreated to the bedroom, exhausted by the emotional intensity of the day. "What will you do now?" Grace asked gently. I took a deep breath. "Honestly, I don't know yet. But whatever I do, it will be my choice, not theirs." As everyone finally left, promising to check in the next day, I felt simultaneously drained and empowered. The confrontation had gone almost exactly as planned, but the emotional toll was even greater than I had anticipated. Yet beneath the exhaustion was a sense of vindication, and more surprisingly, the first stirrings of peace. I had brought the truth into the light. I had refused to be manipulated. And while the path forward remained unclear, I knew I would walk it with my head held high, my dignity intact. In the days following the family gathering, our home settled into an uneasy new reality. Harold alternated between periods of confusion, where he seemed to have no recollection of the confrontation, and moments of shame when memory returned. During one such moment of clarity, he sat across from me at our kitchen table, his eyes red-rimmed and sorrowful. "I never meant to hurt you, Darlene," he said softly. "I don't understand myself anymore. I don't know which thoughts are the disease and which are really me." His words pierced my heart despite my anger. This was the cruel duality of loving someone with Alzheimer's. How could I know which actions to attribute to the disease and which to the man? Had the disease merely lowered his inhibitions, revealing feelings that had always existed, or had it fundamentally altered his values and perceptions, creating desires that the real Harold would have never entertained? "I need to know," I said, forcing myself to ask the question that had haunted me for weeks. How long have you had feelings for Margaret?" He looked down at his trembling hands. "I don't know. There was always an attraction, I think. But I never would have acted on it, Darlene. Never. Not until the diagnosis gave you an excuse," I finished for him. He winced at my words, but didn't deny them. "The diagnosis changed everything. Suddenly, the future I thought we had was gone. I felt like I was drowning, and Margaret she was something to hold on to that wasn't about the disease." I understood the impulse, even as it wounded me. In Margaret, Harold had found a connection that wasn't defined by his illness, while every interaction with me had become colored by my role as his caregiver. "Did you ever consider how this would affect me?" I asked, my voice breaking despite my efforts to remain composed. "After everything we've built together." "I wasn't thinking clearly," he admitted. "The disease makes everything foggy, but it also creates these moments of terrible clarity where all I can see is what I'm losing. With Margaret, I could pretend I wasn't sick." His honesty was both a balm and a blade. Part of me wanted to comfort him to fall back into the familiar role of caregiver and protector. Another part wanted to rage at him for the pain he had caused, for the betrayal that had shattered our decades together. In the end, I did neither. I simply nodded, acknowledging his explanation without offering absolution. Some wounds were too deep for simple forgiveness, especially when the person who inflicted them might not fully understand or remember what they had done. That conversation was the most coherent we would have about the affair. As the weeks passed, Harold's cognitive decline accelerated, whether from the stress of the confrontation or simply the natural progression of the disease. The periods of clarity grew shorter and further apart. The man who had calculated with Margaret how to manipulate me into divorcing him gradually disappeared into confusion, leaving me caring for a husband who often didn't recognize the depth of his betrayal. Margaret made one attempt to contact Harold after the gathering, leaving a voicemail that I intercepted. "I still love you, Harold. When things calm down, we can figure this out." I deleted it without letting him hear it. She had lost the right to further complicate his deteriorating mental state. Grace and Thomas became more involved in Harold's care, taking him for afternoons to give me respite. During those precious hours alone, I began the process of rebuilding myself. I joined a specialized support group for spouses of Alzheimer's patients dealing with personality changes and difficult behaviors. In that circle of understanding, I found people who truly comprehended the unique pain of loving someone who was simultaneously present and absent, familiar and strange. My husband of 50 years accused me of stealing from him last week, shared Linda, a soft-spoken woman whose gentle demeanor belied her inner strength. He called the police and told them I was an imposter. My wife thinks I'm having an affair with our son's wife, said Robert, his eyes weary behind thick glasses. She follows me around the house taking pictures as evidence. Their stories didn't mirror mine exactly, but they shared the common thread of loving someone whose disease had transformed them into someone capable of causing deep pain. In their company, I could express my anger, my hurt, and my exhaustion without judgment. The hardest part, I confessed during one session, is that I'll never know how much was the disease and how much was him. I'll never have closure. Heads nodded in understanding. This was the unique grief of loving someone with Alzheimer's, the ambiguity of loss, the constant questioning of what remains of the person you loved beneath the illness. With the support group's encouragement, I began seeing a therapist who specialized in caregiver trauma. Dr. Lewis helped me process not just the betrayal, but the compound grief of losing Harold twice, once to the affair and once to the advancing disease. You need to reclaim parts of yourself that aren't defined by caregiving, she advised during one session. Before you were Harold's caregiver, before you were his wife, who were you, Darlene? Her question stunned me. I had been so consumed by my roles as nurse wife and now caregiver that I had lost touch with my own identity. Who was I outside of my relationship to Harold? Slowly, I began to rediscover myself. I hired a part-time professional caregiver to stay with Harold 2 afternoons a week, allowing me to reconnect with interests I had abandoned. I joined a local book club, resumed swimming at the YMCA, and reconnected with nursing colleagues I hadn't seen in years. 6 months after the family gathering, I made the difficult decision to place Harold in a memory care facility. His needs had exceeded what I could safely provide at home, and the emotional toll of being his primary caregiver while processing the betrayal had become unsustainable. The staff at Sunshine Meadows were compassionate and skilled. Harold's room was decorated with photos from our earlier years together before the diagnosis before Margaret. I visited him daily at first, then gradually reduced to 3 or 4 times a week, as I allowed myself permission to rebuild a life that wasn't centered entirely around his care. Margaret never appeared at the facility as far as I knew. Whatever passion she had felt for Harold apparently didn't extend to visiting a confused man who might not remember her from one moment to the next. Her absence confirmed what I had suspected her attraction had been to the moments of lucidity, to the escape from illness, not to the full reality of loving someone with Alzheimer's. As months passed, I found a new rhythm to my life. I volunteered at an Alzheimer's support organization, using my nursing background and personal experience to help other families navigate the challenging journey. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during the intense caregiving years. I even began traveling again, short trips with Judith or Sam that reminded me of the world beyond illness and betrayal. On Harold's 70th birthday, I brought cupcakes to share with him and the other residents in his unit. He was having a relatively good day, recognizing me as someone important to him, even if he couldn't quite place who I was. "You're very kind," he told me as I helped him blow out a single candle. "Do I know you from somewhere?" "Yes, Harold," I said gently. "I'm Darlene. I'm your wife." His eyes widened momentarily with recognition. "Darlene," he repeated. "My Darlene." For a fleeting moment, I saw my Harold again, the man I had loved for 40 years, the man who had existed before betrayal and disease had transformed him. I held on to that moment, storing it away, as a precious reminder that beneath everything, some essential connection remained. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on the journey of the past year and a half. The pain of Harold's betrayal had not disappeared, but it had evolved into something I could carry without being crushed by its weight. The anger had gradually given way to a complex form of compassion, not just for Harold, but for myself. I had not given Harold and Margaret what they wanted. I had not filed for divorce, had not played the role of villain in their story. Instead, I had claimed my own narrative, one of resilience, dignity, and ultimately, self-reclamation. The question of how much of Harold's betrayal was the man versus the disease would never be fully answered, but I had come to understand that the question itself mattered less than I had once thought. What mattered was how I had responded to the betrayal, how I had refused to be defined by victimhood, how I had found strength I never knew I possessed. In those quiet moments of clarity that still occasionally emerged through Harold's confusion, I sometimes saw genuine remorse in his eyes. Whether it was for the affair itself or for the pain it had caused me, I couldn't know for certain. But I had reached a place where that uncertainty no longer consumed me. I had learned that forgiveness is not a single act, but a process, one that happens in increments so small they're almost imperceptible until you look back and realize how far you've come. I hadn't forgiven completely, perhaps never would, but I had found a way to honor both my pain and the love that had preceded it. As I pulled into my driveway, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at me was changed, marked by betrayal and grief. Yes, but also strengthened by survival, by the knowledge that she could face the unimaginable and still find reasons to move forward with grace. Life had not unfolded as I had once imagined. The retirement years I had pictured with Harold had been replaced by a reality I never could have anticipated. Yet within that altered landscape, I had discovered a resilience that transcended betrayal, a dignity that no deception could diminish, and a self-worth that existed independent of any relationship. In the end, Harold's betrayal had not defined me. My response to it had. And in that response, I had found not just survival, but a kind of triumph that nothing, not even Alzheimer's, could take away. Have you ever had to find strength during a betrayal? I would love to hear how you handled your situation in the comments below. If this story touched you in any way, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more journeys of resilience and dignity. Remember, sometimes our greatest growth comes from our deepest pain. Thank you for listening, and may you find peace in whatever challenges you're facing today.